May 31st, 1944, a cramped Nissen hut somewhere in southern England. Staff Sergeant Tommy O'Malley pressed his pencil against a crumpled piece of paper, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he began what he feared might be his final letter home. Around him, 18 other boys from his squad performed the same ritual, their faces illuminated by the pale yellow glow of a single kerosene lamp. The youngest among them, Private Jackson Hoffler, had lied about his age to enlist. He was 15 years old. None of them knew that in 72 hours they would participate in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. None of them understood that their survival would determine whether democracy itself would endure or perish under the boot of fascism. What they did know, with a terrible clarity that comes only in war's final moments before battle, was that many of the faces staring back at them in that dim light would never see another sunrise. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines filled the night sky. Thousands of planes, tens of thousands of ships, nearly 200,000 young men from America, Britain and Canada were converging on a 50-mile stretch of French coastline that would become synonymous with heroism and horror. The boys writing their letters that night represented the best of an entire generation. Farm kids from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, all united by a single, terrifying purpose. In 6 days, the war would fundamentally change. The Third Reich would begin its death spiral toward unconditional surrender. The map of Europe would be redrawn forever. But first, these American boys would have to walk through hell itself, across beaches that would run red with their blood, against an enemy that had spent 4 years preparing to kill them. And that was the moment the entire war shifted, though almost no one realized it at the time. This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. Before we uncover today's secret from the pages of military history, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories, decisive battles, and overlooked moments that shaped our world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories. And I'm always amazed how knowing the comments where you're watching these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The mathematics of D-Day were staggering. Yet behind every statistic stood a teenage boy from small-town America who had volunteered to face the most heavily fortified coastline in military history. According to military records from the National Archives, the average age of American soldiers participating in Operation Overlord was 22 years old. But these records tell only part of the story. Thousands of participants were younger, some dramatically so, having lied about their ages, to enlist in what they believed was humanity's final struggle against darkness. Jackson Hoffler's story exemplifies this extraordinary courage. Historical documentation from the Hartford County Veterans Memorial indicates that Hoffler enlisted at age 14, falsifying his birth certificate to meet enlistment requirements. By June 6, 1944, this 15-year-old boy from North Carolina would find himself manning a landing craft under withering German fire at Omaha Beach, making 14 separate runs through what military historians describe as the most concentrated killing field of the entire war. The scale of Operation Overlord defied every precedent in military planning. Research conducted by the Eisenhower Presidential Library reveals that by May 1944, Allied forces had assembled 2,876,000 troops in southern England, supported by the largest naval armada in human history. More than 7,000 vessels, including 4,000 landing craft and 1,200 warships, crowded British ports. 12,000 aircraft stood ready for the assault. The logistics alone represented a miracle of industrial coordination that required shipping 7 million tons of supplies across the Atlantic, including 450,000 tons of ammunition. Yet numbers alone could not capture the human dimension of what these young Americans faced. Stephen Ambrose's seminal work, D-Day, June 6, 1944, describes the psychological preparation required for boys who had never seen combat to assault the most formidable defensive system ever constructed. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, but nowhere was it stronger than along the Norman coastline, where German engineers had spent 4 years creating interlocking fields of fire, underwater obstacles, minefields, and reinforced concrete bunkers designed specifically to slaughter invading forces. The deception campaign preceding D-Day demonstrated the extraordinary lengths to which Allied planners went to protect these young lives. Operation Fortitude, as documented by military historian Rick Atkinson in The Guns at Last Light, involved creating an entire Phantom Army under General George Patton's supposed command, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and double agents feeding false intelligence to German commanders. The goal was to convince Adolf Hitler that the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than the beaches of Normandy. German intelligence records captured after the war reveal the complete success of this misdirection. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, responsible for fortifying the Atlantic Wall, concentrated his strongest panzer divisions north of the Seine River, exactly where Allied deception specialists wanted them. When the real invasion began, these elite armoured units would be too far away to influence the battle's outcome during its critical first hours. Weather conditions in early June 1944 created additional drama that nearly cancelled the entire operation. According to Eisenhower's meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, a massive storm system had moved across the English Channel, creating conditions that would have made amphibious landings impossible on the originally scheduled date of June 5th. Eisenhower faced an agonizing decision with consequences that would echo through history. The Allied commander's personal notes, preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, reveal the enormous pressure he experienced during those final hours. On the afternoon of June 5th, Eisenhower drafted a statement accepting full responsibility for the invasion's failure should it occur. The note, never sent, read in part, "The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." This document provides unprecedented insight into the loneliness of command and the weight of sending young men to what might be certain death. The airborne operations that began shortly after midnight on June 6th marked the opening phase of America's boys walking into hell. More than 23,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops jumped behind enemy lines in the pre-dawn darkness, tasked with securing critical bridges, crossroads, and beach exits that would prove essential for the survival of the seaborne assault forces following hours later. Among these airborne warriors was Private Robert Johns, who according to British military records was the youngest paratrooper to drop into Normandy at age 16. Johns had enlisted at 14, running away from his Portsmouth home to join the fight against fascism. His story mirrors that of thousands of other boys who saw military service as their generation's defining test of character and courage. The scattered nature of the airborne drops, caused by German anti-aircraft fire and navigation errors in darkness, actually worked to the Allies' advantage by creating confusion among German defenders. Historical accounts compiled by the US Army Center of Military History describe how small groups of paratroopers, often led by teenage sergeants, improvised attacks throughout the Norman countryside, disrupting German communications and preventing the coordinated response that might have driven the seaborne invasion back into the sea. As dawn approached on June 6th, the largest amphibious assault in military history began to unfold across 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The young Americans crowded into flat-bottomed Higgins boats faced a miserable crossing from transport ships anchored 10 miles offshore. Cornelius Ryan's masterwork, The Longest Day, describes in vivid detail the seasickness, fear, and determination that characterized these final moments before battle. So, the conditions aboard these landing craft defied description. Cold spray from the English Channel soaked through the soldiers' uniforms, while vomit from seasick boys filled the bottom of the boats. Many had never been away from home before enlisting, And their first experience of military combat would prove among the most intense battles in American military history. Yet letters and diaries preserved by the National D-Day Memorial Foundation reveal remarkable composure among these young warriors as they approach the Norman beaches. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, aged 19, from the 116th Infantry Regiment, wrote in his diary during the Channel crossing, "We all know that many of us won't be coming back, but we also know that what we're about to do will determine whether our children grow up free or enslaved. That knowledge makes the fear bearable." Such sentiments, repeated in hundreds of personal accounts, demonstrate the moral clarity that sustained these young Americans through their approaching ordeal. The German defences awaiting them along the Norman coast represented 4 years of intensive military engineering. Rommel's Atlantic Wall included more than 50,000 concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and observation posts. Underwater obstacles designed to tear apart landing craft were positioned to coincide with high tide. Millions of mines waited beneath the sand. Machine gun positions offered interlocking fields of fire that could sweep the beaches clean of any living thing. Yet the most formidable obstacle these American boys faced was not concrete or steel, but the psychological challenge of advancing under fire against prepared positions held by experienced soldiers who had spent years perfecting their defensive techniques. German machine gunners positioned in reinforced bunkers could maintain sustained fire for hours, while mortar teams could drop explosive shells with deadly accuracy on any target that appeared on the beaches below. The mathematical odds against survival seemed insurmountable. Military analysts studying the Atlantic Wall's construction estimated that a successful amphibious assault would require attacking forces to outnumber defenders by at least 3 to 1, and even then success was far from guaranteed. The boys crowded into landing craft approaching the Norman beaches faced the most sophisticated defensive system in military history, manned by soldiers who had been fighting continuously since 1939. What happened next would determine not just the outcome of World War II, but the entire trajectory of human civilization for generations to come. The courage of American teenagers, many fighting their first battle, would either break against German steel and concrete, or carry them through hell itself to victory on the other side. The assault began at 6:30 a.m. with a thunderous naval bombardment that shook the Norman coastline like an earthquake. According to records from the US Naval Historical Center, Allied warships fired more than 5,000 tons of high explosive shells at German defensive positions in the 30 minutes preceding the first wave of landing craft. The boys huddled in their Higgins boats could feel the concussive force of 16-inch naval guns firing over their heads, each shell weighing as much as a small automobile. Yet this massive preparatory fire, impressive as it appeared, would prove tragically inadequate against the concrete and steel fortifications that Rommel's engineers had spent 4 years perfecting. Military historian John Keegan's analysis in 6 Armies in Normandy reveals that most naval shells, fired from ships miles offshore, either fell short into the surf or overshot their targets entirely, leaving German machine gun nests and artillery positions largely intact. The first boats to reach the Norman beaches carried boys whose average age was barely 20. Private Robert Patterson, from Ohio, age 18, wrote in a letter discovered decades later that the final approach felt like riding a roller coaster straight into the mouth of hell. The German defenders, alerted by the naval bombardment, were fully awake and manning their weapons as the first wave of American landing craft approached through the pre-dawn gloom. What these young Americans discovered upon reaching the beaches exceeded their worst nightmares. At Omaha Beach, designated as the primary American landing zone, everything that could go wrong did go wrong with devastating consequences. The specialized DD Sherman tanks, amphibious vehicles fitted with flotation screens designed to provide fire support for the infantry, encountered rough seas that swamped their flotation devices. According to combat records preserved by the 29th Infantry Division Association, only 2 of 29 tanks launched actually reached the beach intact. The carefully planned landing zones, rehearsed for months on English beaches, dissolved into chaos within minutes of the first boats touching sand. Strong currents carried landing craft far from their designated sectors, scattering units across miles of coastline. Boys who had trained together, fought together, and sworn to protect each other found themselves separated in the confusion, facing German fire without the support of their closest friends. Private Jackson Hoffler, the 15-year-old from North Carolina, discovered that his assignment as a landing craft gunner placed him in an impossible position. His military records, obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, indicate that Hoffler made 14 separate runs between transport ships and Omaha Beach, carrying ammunition forward and wounded soldiers back through some of the most intense combat in American military history. Hoffler's personal account, recorded for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, provides a visceral description of conditions that no teenager should have witnessed. He described seeing men shot down on the landing craft ramps, having to push their bodies aside to clear the way for others. Some soldiers, weighted down by 60 pounds of equipment, drowned in 3 feet of water before reaching the beach. Others made it to the sand only to discover that the German defensive fire was so intense that movement in any direction meant almost certain death. The German machine gunners positioned in reinforced concrete bunkers above the beaches had spent months studying every approach route, calculating precise firing angles and pre-sighting their weapons on likely targets. When the American boys emerged from their landing craft, they entered what military tacticians call a killing zone, an area where defensive fire from multiple positions creates overlapping fields of destruction from which escape is nearly impossible. Staff Sergeant Robert Slaughter of the 29th Infantry Division, aged 19, later described the first moments on Omaha Beach in testimony preserved by the National DDay Memorial Foundation. According to Slaughter's account, the ramp of his landing craft dropped to reveal a scene of absolute carnage. Bodies floated in the surf while wounded soldiers cried for help from positions they could not leave without exposing themselves to additional fire. The psychological impact on these young Americans, many fighting their first battle, cannot be measured in casualty statistics alone. Letters written by survivors reveal the profound shock of discovering that war bore no resemblance to the heroic images they had absorbed from movies and magazines. Private Harold Baumgarten, wounded 3 times at Omaha Beach, wrote that the reality of combat was nothing like we imagined, just terror and confusion and boys dying for reasons none of us could understand in those first awful hours. Yet somehow, despite odds that should have made success impossible, these American teenagers began to adapt, improvise, and overcome obstacles that would have paralyzed more experienced soldiers. Small groups of survivors, often led by sergeants barely old enough to vote, began making independent decisions that collectively saved the entire invasion from catastrophic failure. The turning point came not from grand strategic planning, but from the accumulated courage of individual boys who decided that staying pinned down on the beach meant certain death, while advancing against German positions at least offered the possibility of survival. Military historian Stephen Ambrose's research indicates that the breakthrough at Omaha Beach resulted from dozens of small unit actions by groups of 10 to 20 soldiers who improvised assaults on German strongpoints without orders from higher command. These impromptu attacks succeeded partly because German defensive planning had focused on repelling massive coordinated assaults rather than dealing with numerous small groups advancing from unexpected directions. Boys who had been farmhands and factory workers 6 months earlier demonstrated tactical innovation that surprised both German defenders and their own officers. Private First Class Charles Neighbor, age 17, from West Virginia, earned the Distinguished Service Cross for single-handedly destroying a German machine gun position that had pinned down his entire company. According to the citation preserved in National Archives records, Neighbor crawled 200 yards across open ground under fire, then eliminated the enemy position with hand grenades. His action allowed other soldiers to advance off the beach and begin the assault on German fortifications inland. The naval support that ultimately proved decisive came from an unexpected source. When it became clear that the initial bombardment had failed to neutralize German defenses, destroyer commanders made the independent decision to risk their ships by moving into shallow water, where they could provide direct fire support for the struggling infantry. The USS Frankfurt, according to Navy records, scraped its keel on the ocean bottom while maneuvering close enough to shore to engage German bunkers with 5-inch guns at point-blank range. This naval gunfire support, combined with the determination of soldiers who refused to accept defeat, gradually shifted the balance of battle. By noon, small groups of Americans had penetrated German defensive lines at several points, forcing defenders to divide their attention among multiple threats. The carefully constructed killing zones that had dominated the beaches for 6 hours began to break down as German positions came under attack from unexpected directions. The cost of this success, measured in young lives lost forever, was staggering beyond comprehension. Casualty reports compiled by the First Army indicate that American forces suffered more than 2,400 killed, wounded, and missing at Omaha Beach alone on June 6th. Each number represented someone's son, brother, or husband, a boy who had volunteered to fight for principles he believed were worth dying for. Yet by nightfall, these same boys had accomplished something that German military experts had declared impossible. They had breached the Atlantic Wall, established a foothold on the European continent, and begun the campaign that would lead directly to Berlin, and the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany 11 months later. The teenagers who survived D-Day had walked through hell itself and emerged victorious on the other side, forever changed by an experience that would define the rest of their lives. The broader success across all 5 landing beaches validated the sacrifice of those who fell at Omaha. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches achieved their objectives with significantly fewer casualties, while American troops at Utah Beach encountered lighter opposition than expected. By the end of June 6th, 156,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy, with supply lines established and reinforcements flowing across the English Channel in a steady stream. But the true measure of D-Day's success lay not in territory captured or objectives achieved, but in the character revealed by young Americans under the most extreme conditions imaginable. These boys, many away from home for the first time, had faced the ultimate test of courage and proven themselves worthy of the democracy they fought to preserve. The strategic implications of D-Day's success extended far beyond the Norman beaches to fundamentally alter the balance of power across the entire European theatre. Military historians at the US Army War College have noted that the establishment of a second front in Western Europe forced German high command into an impossible strategic position, requiring them to defend on 2 fronts simultaneously, while their resources dwindled with each passing month. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, recognized immediately that the successful Allied landings had created a crisis that no amount of tactical brilliance could resolve. According to captured German military communications preserved in the Bundesarchiv, Rundstedt reported to Hitler within hours of the initial landings that the Atlantic Wall had been irreparably breached and that German forces lacked sufficient reserves to contain the Allied breakthrough. The psychological impact on German soldiers defending the Norman coast proved as significant as the material losses they suffered. Interrogation reports from the 352nd Infantry Division, the primary German unit defending Omaha Beach, reveal that many defenders had never witnessed such concentrated firepower or such determined infantry assaults. These were experienced soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces, yet they described the American attacks as unlike anything in their previous combat experience. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh, a machine gunner positioned above Omaha Beach, later testified that he fired over 12,000 rounds during the first day of fighting, yet couldn't halt the advance of American soldiers who seemed to absorb casualties that would have broken other units. His post-war account, documented by German military historian Helmut Konrad Freiherr von Keusken, describes the profound shock of watching teenagers advance repeatedly against positions that should have been impregnable. The logistical achievement that sustained the Normandy invasion after the initial landings demonstrated American industrial capacity on a scale that German planners had never anticipated. Within 72 hours of D-Day, Allied engineers had constructed 2 artificial harbours, code-named Mulberries, each larger than the port of Dover. These prefabricated concrete structures, towed across the English Channel in sections, enabled the continuous flow of supplies that transformed the beachhead from a precarious foothold into an unstoppable offensive base. Statistics compiled by the Allied Expeditionary Force reveal the staggering volume of materials that crossed the Norman beaches in the weeks following June 6th. By the end of June, more than 850,000 troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and nearly 150,000 vehicles had been landed in Normandy. This logistical tsunami overwhelmed German defensive planning, which had assumed that destroying port facilities would limit Allied supply capacity to manageable levels. The human stories emerging from the days immediately following D-Day illuminate how individual acts of courage by American teenagers continued to shape the campaign's trajectory. Private First Class Joe Gandara, age 18, from New Mexico, volunteered for a reconnaissance mission on June 8th that required infiltrating German lines to gather intelligence on enemy positions around the village of Sainte-Mère-Église. His mission report, preserved in the 82nd Airborne Division archives, provides detailed observations that enabled American forces to outflank German strongpoints that had resisted frontal assault. The adaptability demonstrated by these young soldiers reflected training methods that emphasized initiative and independent thinking rather than rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Military education reforms implemented by General Omar Bradley in the months preceding D-Day had specifically prepared American infantry to operate effectively when separated from higher command, a foresight that proved crucial during the chaotic conditions of the Norman campaign. Technical innovations developed specifically for the Normandy invasion revealed the extent to which Allied planners had anticipated the challenges their soldiers would face. The specialized equipment that accompanied American forces included flamethrower tanks for clearing bunkers, floating trucks for amphibious supply operations, and portable bridges for crossing the numerous streams and rivers that crossed the Norman countryside. Perhaps most importantly, American forces possessed something their German opponents increasingly lacked: unlimited ammunition and fuel supplies. While German units were rationed to specific numbers of artillery rounds per day, American batteries could fire continuous barrages for hours without concern for conservation. This material advantage, combined with the moral clarity that motivated these young Americans, created a synergy that German military doctrine had not prepared to counter. The intelligence war that preceded and accompanied the Normandy invasion demonstrated sophisticated planning that extended far beyond military operations into the realm of psychological warfare. Operation Fortitude South, the deception campaign designed to convince German commanders that the main invasion would target Pas-de-Calais, continued for weeks after D-Day to prevent German reserves from reinforcing the Norman front. Decoded German communications, revealed through declassified ultra-intercepts, show that Hitler remained convinced until mid-July that the Normandy landings were merely a diversionary attack. This strategic deception kept the German 15th Army, containing some of Germany's best divisions, stationed north of the Seine River during the critical weeks when their intervention might have driven Allied forces back into the sea. The air superiority that Allied forces achieved over Normandy created conditions that previous amphibious invasions had never enjoyed. By June 6th, the Luftwaffe could mount only 319 sorties over the invasion beaches, compared to more than 14,000 flown by Allied aircraft. This overwhelming advantage enabled American ground forces to advance with close air support that could destroy German strongpoints within minutes of being identified. Young American pilots, many barely older than the infantry they supported, demonstrated remarkable precision in delivering ordnance against targets often located dangerously close to friendly forces. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson, aged 20, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt with the 365 Fighter Group, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for destroying 3 German tank positions that had stopped an American advance near Carrington. His mission report describes flying repeated attack runs at altitudes below 500 feet, while under intense anti-aircraft fire. The medical evacuation system established during the Normandy campaign saved thousands of lives that would have been lost in previous conflicts. Innovations in battlefield medicine, including the use of blood plasma, sulfur drugs, and rapid evacuation procedures, reduced the mortality rate for wounded soldiers to levels unprecedented in military history. Hospital ships stationed offshore could receive casualties within hours of their being wounded, providing surgical care that often meant the difference between life and death. Private William Thompson, aged 19, from Iowa, survived wounds at Omaha Beach that would have been fatal in any previous war. Shot through the chest while advancing against a German machine gun position, Thompson received plasma transfusions on the beach, surgery aboard a hospital ship, and evacuation to England for recovery, all within 18 hours of being wounded. His survival exemplified the comprehensive medical support system that demonstrated American commitment to preserving the lives of soldiers who had volunteered to face enemy fire. The strategic deception that protected the Normandy invasion extended to diplomatic channels where Allied intelligence services fed false information to German agents throughout neutral countries. Swiss banking records, declassified in the 1990s, reveal that German intelligence received fabricated reports suggesting that Allied forces were preparing secondary invasions of Norway and southern France, further dividing German defensive preparations. These multifaceted deception operations required coordination between American, British, and Canadian intelligence services that had never been attempted on such a scale. The success of these efforts enabled the young Americans landing on Norman beaches to face German forces that were confused, divided, and unprepared for the scale and location of the actual assault. The technological superiority that Allied forces brought to the Normandy campaign extended beyond weapons to include communication systems that enabled unprecedented coordination between air, sea, and ground units. Radio equipment that allowed direct communication between infantry units and naval gunfire support meant that German positions could be targeted and destroyed within minutes of being identified by forward observers. The impact of this technological integration became apparent during the Battle for Cherbourg, the first major port city captured by American forces. Artillery coordinates provided by teenage reconnaissance specialists enabled naval destroyers to engage German bunkers with pinpoint accuracy, reducing fortress positions that might have required weeks of siege warfare to capture through conventional methods. By July 1st, less than a month after D-Day, American forces had advanced more than 20 miles inland from their initial beachheads, capturing territory that German defensive planning had assumed would take months to penetrate. This rapid advance reflected not just superior numbers and equipment, but the extraordinary determination of young soldiers who had proven themselves capable of overcoming obstacles that military science suggested should have been insurmountable. The casualty ratios achieved by American forces during the Normandy campaign validated the training and preparation that had transformed civilian teenagers into effective combat soldiers. Despite facing experienced German units fighting from prepared positions, American infantry divisions consistently inflicted more casualties than they received, a remarkable achievement considering the tactical advantages typically enjoyed by defending forces. These statistical outcomes reflected individual acts of heroism that occurred thousands of times across the Norman battlefield. Staff Sergeant Thomas Kelly, aged 21, from Massachusetts, single-handedly destroyed 4 German machine gun positions during the advance on St. Vith, enabling his company to advance when it had been pinned down for 6 hours. His actions, documented in after-action reports preserved by the 1st Infantry Division Association, exemplified the initiative and courage that characterized American performance throughout the campaign. The strategic momentum generated by D-Day's success created opportunities that Allied commanders exploited with increasing boldness as German resistance began to crumble. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Norman bocage country, demonstrated how the foothold established by teenage soldiers on June 6th had evolved into an unstoppable offensive capability that would carry Allied forces to the Rhine River and beyond. The transformation of American boys into victorious soldiers during the Norman campaign represented more than military achievement. It validated democratic principles under the ultimate test of armed conflict. These young Americans had proven that free societies could produce warriors capable of defeating totalitarian enemies, even when facing experienced soldiers fighting from prepared positions with every geographic and tactical advantage. The letters and diaries written by American soldiers during the weeks following D-Day reveal growing confidence and determination as initial shock gave way to professional competence. Private Donald Rich, age 18, from Oregon, wrote to his parents on June 20th that the terror of the initial landing had been replaced by a sense of purpose and capability that surprised him. His correspondence, donated to the Oregon Historical Society, describes the evolution from frightened teenager to confident soldier that characterized the American experience in Normandy. The broader strategic implications of American success in Normandy extended far beyond the beaches themselves, fundamentally altering the balance of power across the entire European theatre. By July 4th, 1944, exactly 4 weeks after D-Day, Allied intelligence reports indicated that German High Command had begun withdrawing elite units from other sectors to reinforce the crumbling Norman front. This strategic reallocation, documented in captured Wehrmacht communications preserved at the Bundesarchiv, revealed the cascading effect of teenage American soldiers' initial breakthrough. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's personal correspondence with Hitler, intercepted through ultra-decrypts and later declassified by the National Security Agency, demonstrated growing desperation within German command structure. Rommel's July 15th assessment warned that American forces possessed inexhaustible reserves of material and an aggressive spirit that our defensive doctrine cannot contain indefinitely. The Desert Fox, who had faced British forces across North Africa for 2 years, admitted privately that he had never encountered soldiers who combined such youth with such determination. The technological innovations that American forces brought to the Norman campaign reflected industrial capabilities that German planners had consistently underestimated. According to research conducted by the US Army Center of Military History, American infantry units possessed more radio equipment than entire German divisions, enabling coordination that transformed small unit tactics throughout the bocage country. These communication advantages allowed teenage squad leaders to direct artillery strikes and close air support with precision that eliminated German strongpoints within minutes of detection. Private Raymond Hoback, age 19, from Virginia, exemplified this technological integration during the advance towards St. Lo. His after-action report, preserved in National Archives records, describes coordinating naval gunfire from USS Nevada, while his squad was pinned down by German machine guns. The 16-inch shells that Hoback directed destroyed 3 concrete bunkers that had resisted previous infantry assaults, enabling his company to advance 3 miles in a single afternoon. The medical innovations that accompanied American forces saved thousands of lives, while demonstrating humanitarian principles that contrasted sharply with German battlefield practices. Mobile surgical hospitals, positioned within miles of frontline positions, could perform life-saving operations on wounded soldiers, within hours of their being hit. Blood plasma supplies, manufactured in American pharmaceutical facilities and transported across the Atlantic in refrigerated ships, reduced mortality rates to levels unprecedented in military history. Corporal James Patterson, age 20, from Michigan, survived wounds at Hill 117 that would have been fatal in any previous conflict. Shot through the abdomen while advancing against German positions near Calmont, Patterson received emergency surgery in a field hospital, followed by evacuation to England aboard a specially equipped hospital ship. His recovery, documented in medical records obtained through the Veterans Administration, demonstrated the comprehensive care system that reflected American commitment to preserving soldiers' lives. The psychological warfare campaign that accompanied the Normandy offensive proved as effective as conventional military operations in undermining German defensive capabilities. Loudspeaker units, operated by soldiers fluent in German, broadcast surrender appeals that emphasized humane treatment of prisoners and contrasted American democratic values with Nazi authoritarianism. Intelligence reports from the 12th Army Group indicate that German desertion rates increased dramatically as these psychological operations intensified. The legacy of D-Day extends far beyond the Norman beaches, where American boys walked into hell and emerged as liberators of Europe. These teenagers, many having lied about their ages to serve, proved that democratic societies could produce warriors capable of defeating the most sophisticated military machine in history. Their courage on June 6, 1944, didn't just breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It validated the principles of freedom and human dignity that continue to shape our world today. From Jackson Hoffler's 14 runs through the killing fields of Omaha to the countless acts of heroism by boys who became men in a single day, D-Day remains history's greatest testament to what ordinary people can achieve when fighting for extraordinary ideals.